Hello, everybody. Glad to be here. Looking forward to learning and hearing from everybody. Elliot's going to be the DJ and control the slides, and then we'll kind of go back and forth from there. I'm Raphael Travis. I am a clinical social worker, a doctorate in public health. Right now, I'm at Texas State University in the School of Social Work. I'm a professor there, also the director of the MSW program, the Graduate Social Work program. Also director of my organization, FlowStory, which really aims to bring a lot of the things that we've learned in the research world and try to translate that in a way that could be useful to people that are on the ground doing the work every day. So it's kind of a partnership between science and the artistry of people's practice. And really glad to be here today. I've gotten a chance to kind of from afar see some of the great strides that have been made in California, and the great programming and just the amazing people that are invested in seeing young people be the best versions of themselves. So it's really exciting to be a part of this conversation.
I'm Dr. Elliot Gann, aka Philip Drummond. I'm a beat maker, DJ, community activist, events organizer. I'm a licensed psychologist and psychotherapist. I'm trained in traditional psychotherapy, and during my training, my clinical training, I also integrated in using hip hop, my love for beat making and DJing and hip hop, and tried to see if that could help clinically, and sure enough, I found in many cases it was very helpful. At this point, I've done a lot of work internationally and nationally, thus the impetus for the Learning Spanish. We just got a U.S. State Department grant to go down to Chile to work with some of our collaborators down there and train them in the therapeutic beat making model that I've pretty much dedicated my life to, and is at the core of what we do at the nonprofit of which I'm director, Today's Future Sound. Shout out to Marlon Richardson of Today's Future Sound and Hip Hop for Change, who's one of our senior instructors and a leader within the organization who continues to do incredible work in the juvenile hall, and has been there along with some of our other instructors. Shout out to Rap Nerd, Ellen Williams III, doing incredible work there, and really transformative and powerful work. So I'm really interested not only in the therapeutic as well as educational and pedagogical applications of hip-hop, but also cross-cultural and cultural diplomacy. I went to Senegal with the U.S. State Department in the Next Level program in 2015, and I'm going to Poland in the spring of 2022. Marlon will be going to, I think, Barbados, etc., and a lot of our other staff and folks associated with TFS are part of that hip-hop diplomacy program, and that's really shaped a lot of the international work that I've done since 2015, and the idea of cross-cultural, multi kind of lingual intersectional work that we're doing internationally, trying to share our pedagogy and model in order for folks in other countries to use it. So I'm going to start off with a video summarizing what we do at Today's Future Sound. I'll be using that as an illustration to talk about how one can use hip-hop in therapeutic, empowering ways, and that's something that I really feel passionate about, and why I really enjoy and am honored to work with Dr. Travis, because despite the fact that we come from different so-called theoretical paradigms, our overlap, in if you looked at it in like a Venn diagram, or what we care about, what we think about, what we emphasize, there's such great overlap. And so we've been doing a lot of collaborative programmatic training and research work, as well as publishing a couple articles. So without any further ado, I'm going to jump into the video, and that'll give you an idea of what we do at Today's Future Sound.
At Today's Future Sound, we understand that the power of music can change people's lives. We believe that hip-hop music and culture can be a powerful vehicle in addressing a lack of culturally responsive educational, therapeutic, and social interventions for underserved youth in both our local and global communities. Thankfully, music transcends physical limitations, and with perseverance, we have been able to tackle the challenges of 2020 by implementing virtual models and remote workshops to sustain the important work we do with the youth of Oakland and beyond. This year, we continue to develop our working model, but also innovated with the given circumstances of COVID-19. Our beatmaking workshops exist to build trust, confidence, and community for all ages. The therapeutic beatmaking model, or TBM for short, effectively integrates 3 dimensions that are key for helping support youth who have experienced stress or trauma. Firstly, we know that relationships are the #1 predictor of positive therapeutic outcomes. With this knowledge, we've built a team of experienced teaching artists that are respected experts in their fields and act as musical mentors for the youth.
Relationship building is key to making sure that students not only come because they want to make beats, but that they're building positive relationships with caring adults.
Secondly, the expressive dimension allows students a positive and constructive way to articulate difficult feelings and release stress. Lastly, students build self-confidence and a sense of competency and agency through their mastery of music production.
I learned how to work the beat machine. My favorite thing is my sample, because I like sampling things. I sampled songs from the radio.
we meet our students where they're at, on their headphones. With this, we're able to fulfill a real need in primary and secondary schools, community, and juvenile hall settings where we have pioneered such work. In 2020 alone, our teaching artists have worked with over 2,000 youth. Our flagship program, Beats for Lunch, brings music instructors into schools during lunch hour, providing small group and one-on-one instruction on beat making and music production. Our therapeutic beat making program has now been piloted at several school sites and is actively being utilized in juvenile detention programs and online virtually. Additionally, we've also been using this model with formerly homeless youth and transitioning families. We also work to provide a space for adults and veteran members of the worldwide beatmaking and hip-hop community. At our weekly virtual event, the Global Beat Cypher, we showcase artists from around the world via live stream. It has been consistent since the start of quarantine, substituting for what would have otherwise been our monthly live community events. Our goal for 2021 is to expand our therapeutic beatmaking model into more schools, community, and juvenile justice settings to reach more youth virtually than ever before. Please help us to continue to inspire the next generation.
All right, we're not going to solicit you folks for funds, but it does give kind of a nice intro into our model and into the three dimensions of the therapeutic beatmaking model. And at today's Future Sound, our mission is to use the power of hip-hop music and culture, hip-hop as a culture, a comprehensive one and holistic one at that, to address a lack of culturally responsive and sustaining educational, therapeutic, and social interventions for underserved youth around the world. So I'm going to skip through here. We've also done work with the U.S. State Department in Kentucky, launching a program called Heartbeats program to address the opioid epidemic in Kentucky and in Appalachia. One quick thing I just want to highlight from a pedagogical and educational perspective, and really this overlaps with mental health as well, is that something that I thought about for a long time is the corresponding nature of the five elements of hip-hop, if we're looking at it from a five-element perspective, and the overlapping multiple intelligences that are contained and valued there within, right? And these are things where it's like, usually in school settings, we have an emphasis on just the verbal, linguistic, and logical mathematical, but we think it's really important and that, to teach and deliver information for people and kids to learn experientially through these different modalities. So that's another really central part of our pedagogy and the way we think about it, but it also overlaps with the therapeutic aspects, because not all of what we do therapeutically, including interventions or interpretations, which are usually considered to be verbal in nature, not all of it are verbal. In fact, a lot of it isn't. And so beat making as a nonverbal activity, I still think can have, and I believe really deeply, can have really powerful therapeutic and positive developmental impact, can be very empowering. So these are things that we're thinking about as well. So we have almost all of our workshops culminate in a final beat taper album. We have the students involved in the conceptualization of it. This is part of the therapeutic beatmaking model, and the way that we conceptualize it as being helpful is what we would call like a transitional object, something that you take away, right, like a memento that encapsulates the experience and all the positive experiences that you've had in terms of making the album, and then also further allowing students to empower themselves in their voice as part of this narrative. Narrative is really central to healing from trauma. When in psychotherapy and trauma therapy, the idea is to integrate split-off parts that are caused by trauma and this overwhelming kind of neurophysiological stress response, and to also create a cohesive narrative so that it's what happened to you and you are not your trauma. And part of that can be verbal narrative, and the verbal narrative that you come to an understanding so it no longer overwhelms you. You can put it into this narrative, which is really nice to synthesize and encapsulate it, but it can also be non-verbally. And so I think that this is part of the final product and project that we're aiming for, so kids have something to take away that represents their journey and what they did, their body of work. And so we have free beat tapes that we put up on our Bandcamp and on our website. We have, I think, over 250 or 300 now for free download and streaming. So it's also a library of free beats available as a resource, right? The Global Beat Cypher has been really powerful in this time of COVID to bring the adult community together, and served as a model for how we can come together across cultures and really participate in the virtual cypher, whereas normally we would have in-person beat cyphers with our kids and live events for adults. That's also an important communing and sharing and witnessing. Now, really quickly, I just want to highlight, when we talk about trauma and healing from trauma, I think it's important to acknowledge that most of the youth that we work with and a lot of the communities that we work with aren't just experiencing a single event, a single traumatic event. They are experiencing ongoing everyday trauma. Even poverty itself is a traumatic factor, right? And the things that it brings, and it affects longitudinal, healthy development, or conversely, it can have negative outcomes. We know that based on the ACEs, or Adverse Childhood Experiences study, that the more negative, stressful events we have in our childhoods, the more it impacts our adult outcomes. Now, that doesn't mean you're destined for it or doomed, but it's predictive of. So if we can have, interventions that are using hip-hop or other culturally responsive modalities, these are some of the many things that can help create a buffer and change the outcomes. And it doesn't just have to be hip hop. I really want to acknowledge that parents, coaches, teachers, community members are incredibly valuable in the way that they can help kids and help young people to have positive outcomes. But still, we're up against a lot of really traumatic factors, including institutionalized and systemic racism, policies, policing, etc. These are all traumatic factors. So when we think about what we're dealing with and what the young folks with whom we work, and even a lot of us personally, are dealing with, we have to think about that, the early stressors and traumas and the repeated traumas. That becomes a complex and developmental trauma that impacts our nervous system, our relationships, etc. And so when we're thinking about how hip hop can heal, can empower, and hip hop is, it's not like we invented the therapeutic or healing aspect or the healing power of hip hop, to quote the name of Raphael's book, Dr. Travis's book. Hip hop intrinsically is educational, empowering, and therapeutic. I'm just highlighting some of the aspects that we can use it and how it works from a clinical and theoretical perspective. So when I think about how using beat making and the therapeutic beat making model, how we can heal and address trauma, or really even if we're not dealing with trauma, just empower young people further, there are three things that I think about when people say, well, how's beat making therapeutic? The first is the relationship, and we know that the relationship is the #1 predictor of positive therapeutic outcome across all therapy interventions and therapeutic interventions. This is common sense. As every educator knows, you're not going to have an engaged class or engaged students or a dialogue or a sharing of knowledge in an effective way, or a community or anything happening, if you don't have a relationship and rapport with your students. It's fundamental. You have to have trust and you have to have buy-in. You have to be able to relate in a way where people can really be open to information. And what we know is that trauma takes us offline, out of our learning, out of our executive function in our prefrontal cortex, that we use for learning, remembering, short-term memory to long-term memory, all the kind of control center that's involved in learning and active learning. That goes offline when we get triggered, when we have a stress response. And if you have people who have experienced trauma and are actively experiencing trauma symptoms, they're going to be hyper-vigilant to their environment. They're going to be potentially having, re-experiencing or triggers of trauma that will send them offline, where they're not able to necessarily think or take in information or learn in an effective way because they're just in a survival state. And so repetitive rhythms, a lot of the things that are built into hip hop naturally are regulating and bring us back online. They calm down our nervous system. Relationship is part of that, right? Feeling safe in relation to someone. So we have the relationship. Secondly, the expressive dimension. And this is inherent in so much of hip hop, right? The repetitive movements. It could be when you're spray painting, when you're doing graffiti, repetitive movements in that, the repetitive beats in the cipher, and beats playing, and rhyming, and rapping, and dancing, and all the elements of hip hop and other activities. It's inherent. There's two main ideas here in the expressive dimension and how beat making and beats can be therapeutic and helpful. One, the idea of catharsis, the idea of getting a release and articulating your experience, whether verbally or non-verbally, through beat making, through hitting the pads, through creating something that channels your voice, even if it's nonverbal, and getting a sense of release from articulating it and getting it out and expressing it physically, emotionally, kinesthetically. There's also the repetitive rhythms that we listen to that are involved in beat making. Downregulate our stress response. They calm down our nervous system. And this is why you see it in so many traditional ceremonies and in the cipher, why it's so important to have ciphers, because it can serve as a regulating and joining kind of thing that really makes us kind of calm down and more regulated. It affects our brain waves. The third dimension, the third way that I think about beat making and hip hop in general, we can apply this beyond beat making, right? The third way that I think about it being helpful, useful, and therapeutic is the way that creating beats, a tangible takeaway of creating a beat, making a beat, impacts our self-concept. And I'm thinking about two dimensions of self-concept. Self-esteem, the way that we feel about ourselves in relation to our ideal sense of self, our kind of superhero sense of self. The more we make dope beats, get reinforced by community members or other people, or have the satisfaction of kind of coming closer to our ideal sense of self and doing a good job, the better we feel about ourselves. But also, too, at the same time, self-efficacy, the idea that we can have an impact on the world and that socially that registers and we get feedback from other people and that we know we're impacting the world. That goes in the face of trauma, when we're traumatized, when we are the victim, the passive recipient of trauma, we are effectively taken out of control. And trauma in our body, when we experience dysregulation, is out of our control. But if we can start to have a sense of agency, mastery, even telling a kid, hey, look, you have 4 different options to choose from in terms of this kick drum, or 2, it's your choice. You're flying this spaceship. You're the pilot. You're in charge. You are, you're empowered. Empower yourself by doing this. Then we can help young people to kind of have a different experience from being, like essentially, because we are an ageist society where young people don't have as much power, we then can put them in the pilot seat, if we're using that metaphor, of flying the spaceship or being in charge, and having a sense not only of power and control and autonomy and making decisions, but also starting to create their own narrative and being in control of something. So these are three ways I think about it. I want to show one quick video where Dr. Bruce Perry really affirms the healing power of hip hop and the therapeutic nature of hip hop, talking about rhythms and expression, and what I was talking about in terms of regulation.
One of the things that we're learning more and more about is how unpredictability, chaos, overt threat, significant exposure to violence changes your stress response system. And now there's a lot to that, but one of the core problems with that is that if you're really, really tuned up and you have this continuous state of sort of fear that you're living with, when you go to school, even if it's a good school, you can't learn very well, because parts of your brain that would normally be open for learning are shut down because your brain's saying, that's not that important right now. What's really important is who's connected to who, what's going on outside there, am I going to get hurt? And so when I said rhythm, the reason I said rhythm is that anybody who feels dysregulated, if you move, if music, rhythmic conversation, relational connection, all these things quiet your stress response system and make you capable of learning. And so,
you're saying that hip hop heals?
Absolutely. I am saying hip hop heals. I am saying you can learn more lines of text in rhythm than you can if it's straight prose. You know, they would tell me they'd have these kids. They'd say, "This kid's illiterate. He's got no cognitive issues and blah blah blah. And he can't read." And then I'd start talking with him, and I'd say, "Do you know any music?" And he'd spit out like 25 lines of rhyme, and I go, "There's nothing wrong with this kid's brain. This kid hasn't been regulated enough. He hasn't been taught the right way."
Absolutely.
So again, the idea of regulation, connectivity, connecting, even the call and response in hip hop, when you say hey and I say ho, that's rhythmic interaction that he's talking about. These are the kinds of things, as well as the inclusion in groups and the power of groups, the power of community, which is central to hip hop, right? The idea that it came out of the community, it happens in the cypher. These are so important, and building community, intentional community building in the cypher, sharing the beats in the classroom, and even in the global beat cypher as an adult thing has been immensely powerful. And I can say that even personally, for myself, it's been therapeutic in dealing with COVID, in dealing with isolation, depression, trauma, stress of COVID, stress of these current times, etc., so on and so forth. So with that, I want to pass it off to Dr. Raphael Travis. Raphael, I'll let you take it from here.
So back in about 99, I was a clinical social worker in a group home. And a group home is a transition place oftentimes for young people. If they, are not stable enough to be at home, they may spend time in a group home, or it may be a step down from another facility. Maybe they were in detention and they stepped down to a group home on their way home. And I remember working with one young man. He would always be writing in his book. And, one time I was like, what you writing in there, man? And he was like, I like to write rhymes. And I asked him to, share some with me. First, he was like, nah, I don't know. But eventually he opened up and he just started laying out the most, descriptive, and I worked with him, one-on-one in our sessions. He would talk a little bit, but he would never share that level of depth or emotion of what was going on. And I'm like, whoa, why don't you ever, talk? He's like, long story short, he's like, basically, I can put it here and I can just be myself. I can just lay it all out there. So, eventually like, well, who are some of your favorite artists? And he was like, X, this DMX, but, they call it X. And I was like, well, what do you like about it? And he was like, he's gone through the same thing I am. He's been locked, juvenile detention. He's been detention, he's in group homes. And so a lot of his experiences are similar to mine. And if those of you, RIP, rest in peace to X. If you haven't seen his story, I encourage you to check out one of the books on him. One that's particularly powerful is the one called Earl. But you see that alignment of experiences, and if you hear it through some of the words of the lyrics, and it's very transparent about a lot of what Elliot was talking about, those ACEs, right? Those experiences that people have that are long lasting, they're triggering, they're It's not just the PTSD, as Elliot was saying, it's that continuous traumatic stress that people have to deal with and work through, right, from a survival capacity. But that was one of my earliest experiences that let me know, I grew up in hip hop culture. I'm from New York, and that was a part of life, and it was therapeutic for me just as an individual. I wasn't trying to, it wasn't meant to be, like, it helped me cope and get through life and things like it motivated me and inspired me. But I never thought about it as something to use in my work. But that was one of the earliest experiences that got me thinking in that direction. And I really spent my life since then in that space. And, in the same way that he shared with me, we had the opportunity to check in with a lot of people. And basically the question was, in what ways do you use hip hop in your life? And whether it's through surveys or interviews or these different ways to try to check in with people about how they engage the culture, we found some very common answers, some very common responses. And in many ways, the common denominator is people use it to get better in some way. Maybe to feel better, it may be to cope and deal with some aspect of life, basically to do better. Maybe to, be better as an individual, as a human being, right? To turn over that new leaf or to take it to the next level. When we think collectively, we're talking about better connection to the groups we're part of, whether it's our family, our neighborhood, race, neighborhood, our clique, our set, whatever. Or to think about better conditions. These communities that I care about, I don't want just me to get better. I want us to get better. And you see that over and over again. And really that's a byproduct of what we know about hip hop, right? The common value that's been there since the beginning has been self-improvement and community improvement, right? Those are core values that are part of hip hop, regardless of sort of our professional lens on it. That's been there. You listen to any song, even the things that people sometimes have a hard time with, when people are, talking about, bragging, the braggadocio, people talking about their come up, right? But that's affirming you as an individual, right? And so this idea of empowerment has been a big part of kind of my lens on work and working with young people and groups and thinking about systems and communities. And the great thing, and Elliot talked about it, is thinking about hip hop as a culture, right? So I'm very into lyrics, like that's my thing. I love listening, I love breaking them down, analyzing, helping other people come up with their lyrics. Like I'm just always been into the lyricism, but I'm also into, the DJ and production, the beats, and we know the culture as a whole is empowering. Whatever lane you're in, it does something for you, right? And you and the other people that are into that too, right? That collective. So this idea of hip hop culture and empowerment has been a big part of my interest, and really trying to figure out what are all the different ways that we can create for people to engage the culture so that they feel empowered. They feel, that they can be, regulated and focused and sure of themselves in whatever setting they're in. What are the ways we can help them to understand their strengths so that whatever adversity comes their way, they can tap right into those strengths. And it's not about these external things that they want to validate who they are, right? They know inside who they are and what they're about and what they want to bring to the table. How can we help them, regardless of the situation they're in, to envision what that next level is and how they can take it to the next level, and be a model, a role model for the other people around them that they care about, and think about it not just being about themselves, but how they can be in service to others, right? So that's what we're trying to create. The music and the culture and all those things are great vehicles for individual well-being, and then most importantly, community well-being, because we know, again, kind of building off what Elliot was talking about in terms of ACEs, a lot of times it's those community experiences that are trauma-inducing, right? So just focusing on individuals and their individual growth, that's excellent, but that's part one. Part two is having a clear eye on, well, what are these community spaces that I'm a part of? Are they toxic? Are they unhealthy? Are they able to be a positive support in the ways that we know are important for young people? And so that's where community and change come in, right? a better sense of belonging to the healthy and positive support to their community, recognizing where risk is and being able to make positive decisions to negotiate that risk. And then not the most important, but as important as the others is better conditions for those communities, right? Because we know that people are very, oftentimes they want things to be better, but don't necessarily know how they can participate in that process, right? So wanting to be an active and engaged citizen is different than having opportunities and pathways to be an active and engaged citizen. And so that's a part of what we, in all of these efforts, I encourage us to focus on the individual as much as we focus on the environment. Now I got a couple minutes left. Elliot, you want to switch to the next slide real quick? So that's the model that undergirds all of this work. And just real quick, a lot of people say, well, how, what do you mean empowering in songs? And so one of the things that we tried to do is take a sample song, right? So you can take any song, right? It doesn't have to be the quote unquote conscious song. A lot of times we fall into that trap. You can take any song and really look at it through the lens of how might this be empowering to someone that's engaging it, right? So even things that, on the surface level, you may be like, oh, I don't know about that content. The person that's listening to it may be empowering in some way. And that sometimes it's a high risk empowerment, right? So I can feel better about myself at the expense of someone else, right? Talking down about them or just saying what I have and all of this, right? But it's still empowering to that individual. We can get into negotiating that later. But real quick, so we took a song, Middle Child, and you look, and so these are counts, right? The same way that you could count like metaphors and similes and all that stuff, you can also count things that may be empowering, right? So in this instance, across esteem, resilience, growth, you see all those, right? Growth is the most in there. So that's a receptive way of looking at art, right? So I can take pre-existing art, break it down, analyze it, and have some discussions and maybe act on that. But also on the active and expressive side, right? So the same way that Cole generated this content, the young people that we work with generate their own lyrics about their lived experience and what's going on for them, how they feel about themselves, how they feel about the world. And so, but this gives you an idea of that's the content that they generate, right? And so that's the empowering material that they're building on. And every time they say it, it's reinforcing it and all that kind of stuff. So I just wanted to give you a quick visual. All right, Elliot, last slide. I think I got about 60 seconds left here. And so, from a trauma standpoint, we can look at those lenses of empowerment specific to trauma, right? So we talk about regulation, the importance of being stable enough so that I can think clearly and I can act clearly and I can focus on who do I want to show up and be in this world, my identity. When we're talking about trauma and resilience, we're talking about validating people's stories. Half the time, people never get the chance to either talk about what they've been through, or if they do, it's it's not taken seriously, or it's with judgment and all that kind of stuff. Validating people's story is half the battle most of the time, and then beginning to have conversations about healthy coping. All right. So actually, I think, did you have one more slide on that, Elliot, or is this it? All right. So I just want to end on this point. So as it relates to health and well-being, all of those things are pathways to the things that are important about learning, about growth, about health, completely outside of music, right? So everything that Elliot talked about in terms of connection, that healthy, positive connection, that's what really we're trying to do, is help people take note of what are the relationships that are there for them at the one-on-one level, but also what communities are they a part of? Because we know that connection, we know that community reinforces all of the things that are helpful for healthy growth. So building confidence, empathy, and caring, all of the academic, social, emotional competencies that we know are important, right? Healthy decision-making. So everything that we do that may be empowering through the culture is a vehicle to all of the things that we know are important for health and well-being in the moment, but most importantly, for the life course. We have a very good understanding now about investing in people's young well-being at certain points in their life because of the payoff later. And so we're constantly thinking about the moment in the context of the lifespan as a whole. So thank you so much for the opportunity to speak with you all today. I love the work that everybody is doing. I learn from y'all. I'm inspired by y'all. So I appreciate having the opportunity to be here today. Thank you.